I'm a 29-year-old guy who recently bought my first house. It's a modest place, nothing flashy, but it's mine, and after years of hard work and saving, I finally have a space where I can just breathe and enjoy being on my own. The peace didn't last long, though, because my family found a way to make things complicated. My sister Jessica, 27, is married to Sean, who's 32. Sean's the kind of guy who has a decent job but never seems to have any money. He's always borrowing from someone or crashing on a couch somewhere when things fall apart. Jessica loves him, though, and no matter what he does, she always defends him. I've learned not to say much about it because Jessica gets upset if anyone questions Sean's behavior. A couple of weeks ago, Sean got evicted from his apartment. From what I've heard, he hadn't paid rent for months, even though he makes enough to cover it. Jessica couldn't take him in because, according to her, they're working through some issues, whatever that means. So naturally, my parents called me. They're in their late 50s, and I've noticed they've always had a soft spot for Jessica and, by extension, Sean. They wanted me to let him stay in my guest room just for a little while. I politely said no. I wasn't rude about it, I just explained that I'd worked hard for my house and I didn't want to invite trouble. Sean doesn't exactly have a great track record, and the last thing I need is someone bringing chaos into my space. My parents didn't take it well. They started in with the guilt trips, talking about how family is supposed to help each other out and how they raised me better than to turn my back on someone in need. Jessica got involved too. She called me, crying about how she didn't know what else to do and that Sean had nowhere else to go. It was awkward because she sounded genuinely upset, but at the same time, I couldn't forget all the times Sean had taken advantage of people. He's lived with friends and even distant relatives before, and it always ended with them regretting it. One time, Sean borrowed a few $100s from me. It was supposed to be for a car repair, and he swore he'd pay me back by the end of the month. That was 2 years ago. Anytime I bring it up, he brushes it off or makes some excuse about how he's been struggling. It's not just me, either. My parents have bailed him out financially more times than I can count, and Jessica once admitted to me that he maxed out a credit card in her name. I talked to a couple of friends about the situation. They all told me the same thing: stand my ground. They reminded me of all the red flags with Sean and how letting him move in, even temporarily, could quickly turn into a long-term headache. One of them pointed out that I'd probably end up paying for his food and utilities too. It made sense, but it didn't make the family pressure any easier to deal with. To make things worse, Jessica took to social media. She didn't name me directly, but she made a long, passive-aggressive post about how some people in her life are selfish and don't understand the importance of family. She talked about how she'd do anything for her loved ones and how it hurts when that isn't reciprocated. A few mutual relatives liked and commented on it, basically backing her up, and I started getting texts from extended family members asking why I wasn't helping Jessica and Sean. It's like everyone forgot about the fact that Sean is an adult who got himself into this mess. He had a job, an apartment, and every opportunity to handle his responsibilities, but he didn't. Somehow, though, I'm the bad guy for not wanting to deal with the fallout. Things escalated when my parents called again. They wanted to come over and talk about it in person, which sounded like code for them trying to wear me down until I said yes. I told them it wasn't a good time, but they insisted, saying they just wanted to see the house and spend some time with me. I agreed reluctantly, knowing it was probably going to turn into a lecture about family obligations. After they hung up, I realized I was starting to feel overwhelmed. The guilt, the pressure, and the social media drama were too much. I decided to post about the situation on Reddit, partly to vent and partly to get advice. I figured if anyone would understand how messy family dynamics can get, it would be the internet. I laid everything out: Sean's eviction, his history of taking advantage of people, and the pressure I was getting from my family. I also explained why I was hesitant to let him move in and how I felt like I was being painted as the villain. The response was overwhelming. People shared their own experiences, gave me advice on how to handle the situation, and encouraged me to hold my boundaries. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. Little did I know, things were about to get even messier. Update 1. The response on Reddit was overwhelmingly supportive. Most people said I shouldn't let Sean move in under any circumstances. They pointed out his history of taking advantage of others and emphasized that setting boundaries doesn't make me a bad person. A few even shared their own horror stories about similar situations, which honestly made me feel a little better about holding my ground. But the drama was far from over. After seeing Jessica's social media post, I decided to address it directly. I called her and asked why she felt the need to air our family issues online. She didn't deny it, and instead launched into how I was being selfish, accusing me of prioritizing my comfort over helping family. Things escalated quickly, and by the end of the conversation, she was yelling about how I was driving a wedge between everyone. It didn't matter what I said, she was convinced I was the villain in all this. Not long after, my parents decided to take matters into their own hands. One afternoon, they showed up at my house unannounced. I opened the door to find them standing there with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They claimed they just wanted to see the house, but I knew better. I let them in, and within minutes they were walking around, making comments about how the place was too big for just one person. It was clear they were trying to guilt me into thinking I didn't deserve the space I'd worked so hard for. The conversation eventually shifted to Sean. They went on about how he'd fallen on hard times and just needed a place to get back on his feet. When I reiterated my reasons for saying no, their tone shifted. They started dropping hints about how family doesn't turn its back on family and how they'd always been there for me when I needed help. Then came the ultimatum: either let Sean move in or risk being cut off emotionally. I didn't know what that even meant, but it was clear they were trying to manipulate me. I stayed calm and told them I wasn't changing my mind. After they left, I vented to a few close friends about the visit. One of them suggested that if I absolutely had to let Sean stay, I should have him sign a written agreement outlining the terms, things like a move-out date, sharing expenses, and keeping the place clean. It was a good idea in theory, but I knew Sean wouldn't go for it. He's the type who expects help without conditions. Later that evening, Sean himself called me. He didn't even try to be polite. He jumped straight into saying how unfair it was that I wasn't helping him out. He said he deserved a break and that I was being ridiculous by refusing. It was the first time I'd ever heard him sound so entitled, and it only solidified my decision. I told him that I wasn't comfortable with him staying at my place and ended the call before it turned into another argument. Jessica called again the next day, this time with even more revelations about Sean. She admitted that he'd maxed out credit cards in her name and that she was still paying off the debt. It shocked me that she was still defending him despite everything he'd done. It also confirmed what I'd suspected. My parents had been financially supporting them for years. They'd paid off some of Sean's debts in the past, which explained why they were so desperate to keep him from hitting rock bottom now. Things came to a head when Jessica had a complete meltdown during a family call. She accused me of tearing the family apart and claimed that my refusal to help was going to ruin her marriage. Meanwhile, Sean started spreading rumors among our extended family. I got texts and calls from relatives asking why I was being so cruel and heartless it felt like I was being ganged up on from every direction. Amid all the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged. One of my estranged aunts reached out. She's my dad's sister, and we haven't been close in years, but she heard about the situation and wanted to share her perspective. Apparently, Sean had tried to pull the same stunts with her family a few years back, and it ended in disaster. She warned me not to let him into my home, saying it would only lead to more problems. At this point, I started thinking about the potential legal risks. A friend of mine is a lawyer, so I gave him a call to get some advice. He explained that letting Sean move in without a formal agreement could create all sorts of liabilities. For example, if I ever wanted him to leave, it might not be as simple as asking him to pack his bags. That conversation was the final nail in the coffin for me. There was no way I was letting Sean stay. I posted a second update on Reddit, detailing everything that had happened so far. The response was just as supportive as the first post. People encouraged me to stand firm and shared even more stories about how letting someone like Sean into their lives had gone horribly wrong. Some suggested additional steps like installing security cameras or consulting a professional mediator if things got worse. For now, I'm holding my ground, but I have a feeling this battle is far from over. Update 2. After my second Reddit post, things escalated faster than I could have imagined. Extended family members began to pick sides. A few called to tell me they supported my decision and thought Sean needed to learn accountability. Others, however, weren't so understanding. I got messages from relatives I barely talked to, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful for my family. It was like everyone had an opinion, and somehow I had become the villain in this story. Amid the chaos, more information about Sean started to come out. Apparently, he owed money to multiple family members. One cousin told me he'd loaned Sean a significant amount a couple of years ago, and not only had Sean never paid it back, but he also ghosted the cousin after being confronted about it. Another relative mentioned that Sean was being sued by a former landlord for unpaid rent and damages to an apartment. It seemed like everywhere Sean went, he left a trail of unpaid debts and broken relationships. Meanwhile, Jessica was starting to crack under the pressure. She confided in one of our cousins that her marriage was falling apart. According to the cousin, Jessica was struggling to deal with Sean's irresponsibility and constant financial troubles. She admitted that she'd been covering for him for years, and that she felt trapped. Hearing this didn't surprise me, but it did make me wonder why she was still so determined to defend him publicly, while privately acknowledging his faults. My parents, on the other hand, were doubling down. During one heated conversation, they let slip that they've always bailed Jessica and Sean out because they see Jessica as more fragile. It was a frustrating revelation, but it explained why they were so insistent that I step in now. They had been enabling Jessica and Sean for years, and they didn't want to deal with the fallout of letting them fail on their own. In the midst of all this, someone on Reddit suggested I run a background check on Sean. It was a great idea, so I went ahead and did it. What I found wasn't shocking but still troubling. Sean had a few minor legal issues on record, including some small claims cases and traffic violations. Nothing major, but it painted a clear picture of someone who consistently made bad decisions and expected others to clean up the mess. Feeling validated by everything I was uncovering, I became more determined than ever not to let Sean move in. The support I was getting from Reddit and my friends only strengthened my resolve. But Sean wasn't done yet. One evening, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, there he was, Sean, standing on my porch with a duffel bag in hand. He looked smug, like he expected me to just step aside and let him in. He didn't ask or try to reason with me, he simply announced that he was there to move in. I didn't even bother arguing. I closed the door, locked it, and called the police. The officers arrived quickly, and I explained the situation. Sean tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, claiming I'd invited him over. Fortunately, the police weren't buying it. They told him to leave and warned him not to come back unless he wanted to be charged with trespassing. As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and disbelief. This guy really thought he could just show up and force his way into my life. The fallout from that incident was immediate. Jessica accused me of escalating things unnecessarily and making Sean look bad in front of the neighbors. My parents were furious, calling me heartless and selfish for involving the police. They kept saying that I was ruining the family by refusing to help. It was exhausting, but I wasn't about to back down. Meanwhile, the local community had started talking about the drama. Apparently, word had spread about Sean's eviction, my refusal to take him in, and the police showing up at my house. My parents were embarrassed, which only added fuel to their anger toward me. They started avoiding my calls and stopped showing up unannounced, which was a small blessing in disguise. To protect myself, I took some extra precautions. I installed security cameras around the house and reinforced the locks on my doors and windows. I even put up a gate to make it clear that my home was not open to uninvited guests. It felt a bit over the top, but given how far Sean and my family had gone, I didn't want to take any chances. Surprisingly, Jessica started to distance herself from Sean. She stopped defending him as aggressively and began spending more time with friends and relatives who were critical of his behavior. It seemed like she was slowly realizing just how toxic the situation had become. I shared all of this in another Reddit update, and the post went viral. People were fascinated by the unfolding drama and the steps I was taking to protect myself. Many commenters shared their own experiences and offered advice on how to deal with family pressure and entitlement. The support was overwhelming and honestly helped me stay grounded. For now, things have quieted down a bit, but I know this isn't over. My family doesn't give up that easily, and Sean is nothing if not persistent. Still, I'm ready for whatever comes next. Update 3. The fallout from Sean's unannounced visit and the police involvement was only the beginning of the chaos. Not long after, news spread that Jessica had finally separated from Sean. She announced it to a few close family members first, admitting that she could no longer tolerate his irresponsibility and financial recklessness. Word quickly got back to me, and while I was relieved for her, I knew this wasn't the end of the drama. Jessica admitted to one of our cousins that she'd been enabling Sean's behavior for years. She'd covered for him with their finances, defended him to everyone, and tried to fix things that weren't hers to fix. It had taken her a long time to realize that she couldn't keep living that way. This confession made its way through the family grapevine, but instead of support, it triggered a new round of accusations from my parents. According to them, Jessica's decision to leave Sean was my fault. They claimed that my refusal to let him move in had pushed her to make this choice and that I'd driven a wedge between them. They ignored the fact that Jessica herself had said Sean's behavior was the issue. It was easier for them to blame me than to accept that their years of enabling had contributed to the problem. Sean, meanwhile, wasn't taking the separation well. In a desperate move, he tried to take legal action against Jessica. He claimed that she owed him for expenses during their marriage, but it was clear he was grasping at straws. The legal threat only further alienated him from the family. Even relatives who had been supportive of him started distancing themselves, realizing how manipulative he truly was. The extended family was now split into two camps. Some supported me, understanding why I'd stood firm and refused to let Sean take advantage of me. Others sided with my parents, claiming that I'd overreacted and should have helped for the sake of family. The division was noticeable at family gatherings, where the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sean's situation continued to deteriorate. He was couch surfing with friends and distant relatives, but his welcome ran out quickly wherever he went. He owed money to nearly everyone he encountered, and word was spreading about his legal troubles. It wasn't long before he was essentially blacklisted from our extended family and community. No one wanted to deal with his entitlement and the chaos he brought with him. Jessica, on the other hand, was starting to rebuild her life. She began therapy to address her codependency and the years of stress she'd endured in her marriage. She also started reconnecting with family members she'd distanced herself from while defending Sean. It was clear that she was making an effort to grow and move forward. My parents, after weeks of blaming me for everything, finally started to come around. During one conversation, they grudgingly admitted that they'd been wrong to pressure me and that they hadn't fully understood how bad things were with Sean. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was as close as I was going to get. Their acknowledgement felt like a small victory in this long, exhausting battle. On a lighter note, the local community began to rally around me. Neighbors who had witnessed the police incident or heard about the drama expressed their support. Some even shared their own stories of dealing with entitled family members, which made me realize just how common this kind of situation is. It was reassuring to know I wasn't alone in this. Things took an unexpected turn when my Reddit thread started gaining wider attention. It was shared on various platforms and even caught the eye of some media outlets. The story sparked discussions about family dynamics, boundaries, and the importance of standing up for oneself. Seeing how many people could relate to my experience was both humbling and surreal. Jessica reached out to me directly for the first time since things had blown up. She apologized for the way she'd treated me during all of this. She admitted that her anger and accusations were misplaced and that I'd actually done her a favor by holding firm. She thanked me for showing her that enabling Sean wasn't helping anyone and that it was okay to prioritize her own well-being. Sean, of course, wasn't taking any of this quietly. He went on a social media rant, blaming everyone but himself for his situation. He accused me, Jessica, and even my parents of ruining his life. His posts were full of exaggerations and outright lies, but they only ended up making him look worse. Most people saw through his attempts to play the victim. With the worst of the drama behind me, I finally had time to focus on myself and my home. I started working on some small renovations I'd been putting off and spent more time with friends who had been my rock throughout all of this. It felt good to reclaim my peace and independence. Some family members have started mending fences, while others remain distant. I'm okay with that. I've learned that not all relationships can or should be repaired, and that's fine. The important thing is that I stood up for myself and refused to let anyone take advantage of me. In my final Reddit update, I thanked everyone for their advice and support. This experience has been a whirlwind, but it taught me the value of boundaries and the importance of holding firm, even when it's hard. Jessica is on a better path now, and I'm finally at peace. For the first time in a long time, things are looking up. Update 4. Things have been quiet for a while, but that didn't last. Sean, as expected, found a new way to stir the pot. He started contacting family members individually, spinning a sob story about how he'd been treated unfairly. According to him, I was the root of all his problems, and he was the victim of heartless treatment from his own family. It didn't take long for this to reach me. A few relatives called to ask why I wasn't helping Sean and why I'd let things escalate so far. Some of them were clearly falling for his version of events, but others had heard enough to see through it. Meanwhile, Jessica was making real progress. She found a new job that gave her a fresh start, and after months of staying with friends, she moved into her own apartment. This was a big step for her. She also cut off financial ties to Sean, something I never thought I'd see her do. She mentioned to one of our cousins how freeing it felt to finally put herself first and not carry the burden of fixing his messes. Word got back to me, and I couldn't help but feel proud of how far she'd come. Despite Jessica's progress, my parents started giving me the cold shoulder. Even though they'd previously admitted they were wrong to pressure me, their loyalty to Sean and Jessica made them act distant. They weren't outright hostile, but their calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, the conversations felt strained. It was clear they still harbored resentment over how everything had unfolded. At one point, a distant relative of Sean's tried to mediate the situation. They reached out to me, claiming they just wanted to find a solution and help everyone move forward. But it quickly became clear they were more interested in defending Sean. They called me stubborn for not reconciling and suggested I make the first move to smooth things over. I stood firm, reminding them of Sean's repeated failures and manipulative behavior. Unsurprisingly, they didn't have much to say after that. Meanwhile, Sean's situation continued to spiral. He was facing multiple lawsuits from creditors and landlords over unpaid debts. I heard through the family grapevine that he'd lost most of his support network. People were fed up with his excuses and the drama he brought into their lives. It was a stark contrast to Jessica's progress, and it seemed like the gap between them was only growing wider. Then came a surprise visit from my parents. I opened the door to find them standing there, looking more determined than ever. They wanted to talk about Sean. They claimed he deserved a second chance and urged me to reconcile with him for the sake of family unity. I stayed calm and reminded them of Sean's long history of taking advantage of others and shirking responsibility. I told them that while I had no ill will toward him, I wasn't going to let him back into my life unless he showed real change, and even then, it would take time. My refusal didn't sit well with them, and they left visibly frustrated. Later that week, a close cousin stepped in to defend me during a family gathering. They pointed out Sean's history of exploiting others and how my decision to set boundaries wasn't just reasonable, it was necessary. Their support made a huge difference. It shifted the tone of the conversation, and for the first time, it felt like people were starting to understand where I was coming from. I shared these developments in another Reddit update. The advice and encouragement I received were invaluable. People reminded me that I wasn't responsible for fixing Sean's life, and that standing my ground was the best thing I could do for myself, and indirectly for Jessica. The online support continued to be a source of strength as I navigated the ongoing family tensions. At a later family event, Jessica surprised everyone by openly supporting me. When the topic of Sean came up, she defended my actions and admitted that I'd been right all along. It was a huge moment for our relationship and a clear sign of how much she'd grown. Of course, this didn't sit well with my parents. They accused both of us of being disrespectful and ungrateful for everything they'd done for us. The argument didn't last long, but it left a sour note on the gathering. As if things couldn't get messier, Sean sent me a long email. It was a rambling, accusatory message where he blamed me for all his problems. He accused me of ruining his life and claimed that my refusal to help had set off a chain reaction that led to his current situation. I didn't bother responding. His email was just another attempt to shift blame instead of taking responsibility. Jessica, meanwhile, started attending family therapy. She wanted to work through her lingering issues with our parents and Sean. It was another step forward for her, and I could see how much she was benefiting from it. She seemed lighter, more confident, and more at peace with herself. Looking back, it's incredible to see how much has changed. This whole ordeal has taught me the value of boundaries and self-respect. I've grown emotionally in ways I never expected, and I've come to appreciate the support system I have in my friends, certain family members, and even the Reddit community. For the first time in a while, I feel like I'm truly in control of my life. Update 5. Sean's situation took a turn for the worse. With no support left locally, he was forced to move out of state to live with a distant relative. I heard through the family grapevine that this relative had agreed to let him stay, but only under strict conditions. Sean had to contribute financially, stick to a curfew, and follow house rules. Apparently, it wasn't going well. He'd already clashed with them over unreasonable demands, and it sounded like his days there were numbered too. Meanwhile, my parents faced backlash from the extended family for their role in enabling Sean for so long. Relatives who had lent him money or been dragged into his chaos started calling them out, questioning why they defended him for years. Feeling the pressure, my parents made an effort to reconcile with me. They reached out and suggested we meet to clear the air. I was skeptical, but I agreed, hoping this would be a step toward healing. At the meeting, they apologized, albeit reluctantly, for how they'd handled things. They admitted they'd been wrong to pressure me, but quickly shifted to defending their actions as coming from a place of love. While it wasn't a full acknowledgement of their mistakes, it was a start. We talked about boundaries moving forward, and I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate any more manipulation or guilt tripping. They nodded, though I could tell they weren't entirely happy about it. Jessica, meanwhile, had her breakthrough. Sean reached out to her again, this time trying to guilt trip her into bailing him out of his latest financial mess. Instead of caving, she went no contact. She blocked him on all platforms and told close family members not to give him her contact information. It was a huge step for her, and I could see the weight lifting off her shoulders as she started to reclaim her life. My Reddit thread continued to gain traction, sparking debates about family dynamics and personal responsibility. People shared similar stories and offered advice, turning the post into a hub for discussions about standing up to toxic behavior. It even caught the attention of a few online publications, which led to more people discovering and commenting on the story. The support was overwhelming and reinforced that I wasn't alone in dealing with these issues. At my parents' insistence, we held a family meeting to air grievances. It quickly turned into a heated argument. My parents refused to fully take accountability for their enabling behavior and instead focused on how difficult this had been for them. I stayed calm and gave a heartfelt but firm speech about accountability, fairness, and the importance of respecting boundaries. I pointed out how their actions had hurt not just me but also Jessica and other family members. Some relatives supported me, while others tried to play peacemaker, but by the end, it was clear my parents weren't ready to fully change. After the meeting, Jessica approached me privately. She thanked me for standing my ground and admitted that my refusal to enable Sean had inspired her to take control of her life. Hearing that meant more to me than anything else that had happened during this ordeal. It was proof that sticking to my principles had made a difference. Over time, my parents began to come around, though grudgingly. They still harbored some resentment, but they started to acknowledge, in small ways, that I'd been right all along. They stopped defending Sean and began focusing more on supporting Jessica as she rebuilt her life. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. Jessica took things a step further by volunteering at a financial literacy organization. She wanted to help others avoid the mistakes she and Sean had made. She told me about how empowering it felt to turn her experiences into something positive, and I couldn't have been prouder of her growth. As for Sean, his online antics continued to backfire. He posted a series of rants blaming everyone but himself for his situation, but instead of gaining sympathy, he alienated more people. Old friends and colleagues started cutting ties, fed up with his refusal to take responsibility. His social media accounts eventually went dark, and as far as I know, he hasn't resurfaced since. With the drama behind me, I've finally been able to focus on myself. My home feels like a sanctuary again, and my mental health has improved significantly. Locals in my community, some of whom had followed the situation, have expressed admiration for my courage to stand up for myself. It's even led to a few new friendships, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I've set clear boundaries for future interactions with my parents. We've agreed to keep things civil and to respect each other's space, but I made it clear that any attempts to manipulate or guilt me will result in immediate distance. So far, they've honored this agreement, which has helped our relationship slowly improve. Jessica recently sent me a heartfelt letter thanking me for being a role model. She credited my actions with giving her the strength to leave Sean and start over. Reading her words brought a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. In my final Reddit update, I thanked everyone for their support and shared how far things have come. This journey has been exhausting but also transformative. Jessica and I are in a much better place, and I've learned the importance of standing firm in the face of pressure. For the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful about the future for both of us.